On May 25, 2025, the Robertson family said goodbye to the man who had defined every part of their public and private lives. Phil Robertson, the bearded patriarch who turned a homemade duck call into a business empire and a reality show into a cultural phenomenon, died at 79. His daughter-in-law Corey Robertson broke the news for the family, writing that Phil was now with the Lord and thanking fans for years of prayers and support. What she didn't do, and what no member of the family has done since, is spell out exactly how he died. The family kept that private, just as Phil had asked them to keep so much of their lives private, even while millions watched them on television for over a decade. To understand why his death hit so hard, and why what he left behind still stirs up so much emotion in his family, you have to go back to where Phil Robertson actually came from, because almost none of it looked like the empire he eventually built. Phil Alexander Robertson was born on April 24, 1946, in Vivian, Louisiana, one of 7 children in a family that didn't have much of anything except land, woods, and water. Groceries weren't really part of the picture. The family lived off whatever they could grow, fish, or shoot: deer, squirrel, fish, garden vegetables, the occasional hog or chicken they raised themselves. Phil later described it plainly. It was the 1950s by the calendar, but his family was living like it was 100 years earlier. And yet, by his own account, they were happy. That phrase, happy, 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 would eventually become the title of his memoir and something close to a personal motto. But it started as a simple description of a childhood spent poor outdoors, and mostly left alone to figure things out in the swamp. That upbringing did 2 things to Phil. It made him self-reliant in a way that never really left him, and it made him extraordinarily good at the thing poor Louisiana kids did to survive: hunting. He wasn't just competent with a gun or a fishing line. He had a natural feel for the woods that people around him noticed early, and that same physical talent showed up on the football field. Phil was skilled enough as an athlete that he earned a scholarship to Louisiana Tech University, where he became the starting quarterback in 1966 and 1967. Sitting behind him on the depth chart for part of that time was a young Terry Bradshaw, who would go on to a Hall of Fame NFL career and multiple Super Bowl rings with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Most people in Phil's position would have chased that football opportunity as far as it could go. He didn't. He has said many times, in his own blunt way, that he'd rather be out hunting ducks than have large, violent men trying to run him over on a football field. It sounds like a joke, and Phil told it like one, but it was also a real decision with real consequences. He walked away from a path that could have led to professional football because it interfered with duck season. It's one of the clearest early examples of something that defined his entire life, when something conflicted with what Phil actually valued. The thing he valued won, regardless of what it cost him. Phil married Marcia K. Carraway, known to the world later as Miss K, in 1966, when she was 17 and pregnant with their first child. They were both barely adults, with no money and no real plan beyond getting by. For years, that's exactly what they did. Kay held the household together while Phil worked, hunted, and eventually started trying to build something of his own. But the years that followed weren't the wholesome image fans later saw on Duck Dynasty. By Phil's own admission in later interviews, his 20s and early 30s were marked by heavy drinking, a volatile temper, and stretches where he was absent from his family for days at a time. Kay endured a level of instability that Phil himself has openly acknowledged doing real damage to their marriage and their kids. It wasn't a footnote he glossed over. In interviews and in his own writing, Phil described that period honestly as a low point that nearly cost him everything that mattered. The turning point, by his own account, came at a small church in West Monroe, Louisiana. Phil has described walking in restless, skeptical, and not looking for anything in particular, and walking out having committed to Christianity in a way that reshaped the rest of his life. From that point forward, faith wasn't a side detail for Phil Robertson. It became the organizing principle of everything he did afterward. How he ran his business, how he rebuilt his marriage, how he raised his kids, and eventually, how he talked to millions of viewers on television. In 1972, Phil turned his lifelong obsession with duck hunting into a business. He started Duck Commander out of his own home, hand-carving duck calls designed to mimic the exact sound of a live duck more precisely than anything commercially available at the time. It was a small, slow operation in the beginning. Orders filled one at a time, money tight. Success far from guaranteed. Kay worked alongside him through those lean years, raising their children while the business inched forward. The real transformation came later, when Phil's son Willie returned from college and pushed to modernize and expand what had been a niche, homemade operation. Under Willie's direction, Duck Commander grew from a regional hunting gear company into a much larger operation with broader distribution, licensing deals, and eventually media exposure that no one in the family could have predicted when Phil was carving calls by hand in the 1970s. That media exposure arrived in a big way in 2012, when A&E premiered Duck Dynasty, a reality show built around the Robertson family and their business. It was pitched as a simple show about a family-run duck call company, but it became something much bigger, one of the most watched reality series on cable television, at its peak drawing more than 11 million viewers for a single episode. Audiences were drawn to the family's mix of backwoods humor, obvious family loyalty, and Phil's unapologetic, old-fashioned worldview, delivered without any filter. Phil didn't change for the cameras, and that was largely the point. He was the same person on television that he'd apparently been for decades at home. Direct, religious, occasionally abrasive, and completely uninterested in softening his opinions to make anyone more comfortable. That authenticity is a big part of what made him popular. It's also what got him into serious trouble. In December 2013, Phil gave an interview to GQ magazine in which he spoke about homosexuality and, separately, about race relations in the pre-civil rights South, in terms that many people found offensive and that ignited a genuine national controversy. A&E suspended him from the show. Advertisers pulled back. Civil rights organizations and LGBTQ advocacy groups condemned the remarks publicly. At the same time, a large and vocal segment of the public rallied behind him, framing the suspension as an attack on religious expression and free speech. The backlash to the suspension was strong enough that A&E reinstated Phil within a matter of weeks. Phil never apologized for what he'd said. He maintained that his comments reflected his religious convictions, and he treated the entire episode as confirmation that his beliefs would always put him at odds with parts of modern culture, something he seemed to accept, rather than fight against changing. Phil became an increasingly visible figure in conservative politics over the following decade. He publicly supported Ted Cruz during the 2016 Republican presidential primary and later backed Donald Trump. Alongside his son Jace, he co-hosted the podcast Unashamed with the Robertson family, where he talked faith, current events, and his own life with the same bluntness that had defined the GQ interview years earlier. For a segment of the public, Phil Robertson became a symbol of unapologetic religious conservatism. For others, he remained a symbol of everything they found troubling about it. He didn't seem particularly moved by either reaction. Duck Dynasty itself wound down in 2017 after 11 seasons, as ratings declined from their peak, though spin-off projects continued in various forms. In January 2025, A&E announced a revival series, Duck Dynasty. The revival centered on the next generation of the family, with Willie and Corey Robertson at the center. Phil would not appear in it. By then, his health had already begun to take too much from him. In December 2024, the Robertson family shared on the Unashamed podcast that Phil had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Jace also indicated at the time that doctors believed Phil was dealing with a blood disorder as well, compounding his health problems. Fans absorbed the Alzheimer's news the way most people do, bracing for a slow, gradual decline that could stretch on for years. That isn't what happened. By early April 2025, Jay spoke again on the podcast, this time far more directly. "He's not good," Jay said, adding that the family was focused on keeping Phil comfortable and doing what they could for him. It was a stark shift in tone from just a few months earlier, and it signaled to fans that whatever was happening inside the Robertson home was moving faster than anyone outside it had understood. Despite the decline, Phil recorded a handful of final podcast episodes in which listeners noted his voice still sounded remarkably clear and steady, a detail that, in hindsight, stands as one of the last extended glimpses the public got of him speaking in his own words. Phil Robertson died on May 25, 2025, at his home in West Monroe, Louisiana. He was 79. Corey Robertson announced his death publicly on behalf of the family, describing Phil as a man whose life had been transformed by his faith and who spent his final years telling anyone who would listen about it. The family statement leaned on scripture rather than details, a message about grace and reunion rather than an account of his final days. No cause of death was made public, and the family has kept that information private in the time since. The funeral that followed reflected the same instinct toward privacy that had shaped how the family handled his illness. There was no red carpet send-off, no press pool outside the church, none of the political figures who had aligned themselves with Phil over the years attempting to make the moment about themselves. By all accounts, it was a small, private gathering of family and close friends, which, for a man who spent over a decade being watched by millions of television viewers, was very much in keeping with how he'd tried to live outside the cameras. In the aftermath of Phil's death, attention naturally turned to what would happen to the business he'd built from nothing, and to the family that had grown up inside it. Celebrity Net Worth estimated Phil's fortune at around $10 million, built across decades of Duck Commander sales, licensing deals, book royalties, and years of paid speaking engagements and conservative media work. Reports and family commentary in the weeks after his death touched on how the business and various assets might be handled going forward, with Willie, who had been central to Duck Commander's growth and to the family's media presence for years, expected to continue playing a leading role. But the Robertsons have not made the details of Phil's estate or any specific inheritance a matter of public record, and much of what circulated online in the months afterward was speculation rather than confirmed reporting. What is confirmed is simpler, and in some ways more meaningful. Duck Dynasty. The revival moved forward as planned, built around the next generation of the family, carrying Phil's name and influence into a show he would never appear in. It would be easy to reduce Phil Robertson's story to the version most people know: the beard, the catchphrases, the reality show, the controversy. But the more complete picture is a man who grew up with almost nothing, nearly lost his marriage and his family to his own worst instincts in his 20s, rebuilt his entire life around a faith he found in a small Louisiana church, and then spent the next 5 decades building a business, a public platform, and a set of convictions he never once backed away from, popular or not. That's the context that made his death and the quiet, private way his family chose to handle it feel like the closing of something larger than one man's life. Phil Robertson represented a specific kind of self-made, faith-driven, unbothered by outside opinion figure that has become rarer with each passing decade. His family has said in the months since his death that they intend to carry that legacy forward, not just the business, but the version of faith and family he spent his life insisting on. Whether they do it exactly the way he would have is something only time will show. What part of Phil Robertson's story stands out to you the most? The football scholarship he walked away from, the years he nearly lost his family before finding his faith, or the way he refused to soften his views even when it cost him? Let us know in the comments. And subscribe for more stories about the people who shaped the culture in ways that outlasted their time on screen.